The massive lion stood motionless beside the weathered headstone, his graying mane catching the last rays of Texas sunlight as hundreds of onlookers held their breath in stunned silence. For 3 days, Rex hadn't moved from this exact spot, his 420-pound frame a monument of grief that no one could explain. The gathered crowd wasn't witnessing an animal's confusion. They were watching pure, devastating love in its most raw form. A woman in the front row collapsed to her knees, her sobs echoing across the hill as the reality hit everyone at once. This magnificent creature understood death, understood loss, understood that his best friend was never coming home. Children pressed closer to their parents, their innocent questions hanging unanswered in the heavy air while news cameras captured every heart-wrenching second. "Dear God," whispered an elderly man, his voice breaking. How long will he stay there? But what happened next would shatter everything the world thought it knew about the bonds between man and beast, proving that some love stories transcend species and death itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story begins 6 months earlier in the rolling hills of Texas Hill Country, where Frank "Pops" Henderson had spent the last 15 years of his life proving that second chances weren't just for people. At 72, the retired Marine Corps veteran carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to focus on its best. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of working with rescued animals, moved with surprising gentleness as he prepared the morning feed for the 37 creatures that called Second Chance Sanctuary home. Frank's silver hair caught the early morning light as he walked the familiar path to Rex's enclosure, a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and a bucket of fresh meat in the other. This daily ritual had remained unchanged for over a decade, ever since he'd rescued the 6-month-old lion cub from a traveling circus that had abandoned him to die. The massive oak trees that dotted the 50-acre property stood as silent witnesses to countless such mornings, their branches providing shade for animals that had nowhere else to go. "Morning, boy," Frank called out in his gravelly voice, the same greeting he'd used every day for 10 years. Rex, now an 11-year-old giant with a distinctive scar over his left eye, would always respond the same way, standing immediately and padding over to press his enormous head against the chain-link fence. Frank would place his free hand on the lion's massive paw, and they would share a moment of perfect understanding before the business of the day began. Dr. Grace Williams had witnessed this ritual thousands of times, but it never failed to move her. At 45, the veterinarian had found in Frank the father figure she'd lost at age 8, and in the sanctuary, the family she'd never been able to create. Her own story was written in the gentle way she handled the most difficult rescues, the late nights she spent monitoring sick animals, and the fierce protectiveness she showed toward both Frank and every creature in their care. The sanctuary itself told a story of financial struggle and unwavering determination. The buildings needed paint, the fencing required constant repair, and Grace knew exactly how many sleepless nights Frank spent hunched over the books, trying to make the donations stretch far enough to cover feed, veterinary bills, and basic maintenance. The debt had been mounting for months, $180,000 that seemed as insurmountable as the love that kept them fighting for every animal's chance at a better life. But Frank had secrets he kept even from Grace. The heart medication hidden in his truck's glove compartment, the chest pains that left him breathless during feeding time, the growing certainty that his body was failing him just when the animals needed him most. Rex seemed to sense these changes before anyone else, his golden eyes tracking Frank's every movement with increasing concern, his protective instincts sharpening as his human companion grew more fragile with each passing day. The first sign that everything was about to change came on a Tuesday morning when Frank stumbled while carrying Rex's water bucket. The coffee cup slipped from his weathered hands, shattering against the concrete with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire sanctuary. Rex, who had been lying peacefully in the morning sun, immediately rose to his feet, his massive frame tense with concern as he watched his human companion clutch his chest. "Just getting old, boy," Frank muttered, forcing a smile as he bent to collect the ceramic pieces. "Nothing to worry about." But Rex's golden eyes remained fixed on him, and the lion began pacing along the fence line with an agitation that Grace had never seen before. The other animals seemed to sense the shift in energy. The rescued tigers grew restless, and even the normally placid bears began to pace in their enclosures. Grace noticed the changes before Frank was ready to admit them. She found the prescription bottle tucked behind veterinary supplies in the medicine cabinet, 3 months old with only a few pills missing. When confronted, Frank's pride flared like it always did when anyone suggested he might need help. "Ain't hiding nothing, Gracie," he said, his voice carrying the stubborn edge she knew so well. "Just managing things my own way." Managing? Grace's voice cracked with the fear she'd been carrying for weeks. "Pops, your heart medication is 3 months old. When was the last time you actually took one of these pills?" Frank's silence told her everything she needed to know. He'd been gambling with his life rather than burden her with medical bills they couldn't afford. The sanctuary was already drowning in debt, and Grace realized with growing horror that Frank had been choosing between his health and the animals' welfare for months. The black Mercedes arrived 3 days later, its pristine finish a stark contrast to the dusty ranch roads and weathered buildings of the sanctuary. Victor Ashford stepped out wearing a suit that probably cost more than the sanctuary's monthly feed budget, his cold gray eyes scanning the property with the calculating gaze of a man who saw dollar signs where others saw heartbreak and hope. "Mr. Henderson," Victor said, extending a manicured hand that Frank didn't take. "I understand you might be interested in discussing the future of this property." "This land ain't for sale, son," Frank replied, his Marine Corps posture straightening despite the exhaustion that had been weighing him down. "These animals got nowhere else to go." Victor's smile was thin and practiced. "I'm prepared to offer $2 million for the land. That's quite generous, considering your current financial situation." He pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "I've done my research, Mr. Henderson. You're 90 days behind on your mortgage, your property taxes are overdue, and you owe nearly $200,000 in various debts. I'm offering you a way out." From his enclosure 50 yards away, Rex began to growl, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The lion had never shown aggression toward a visitor before, but something about Victor triggered every protective instinct the massive cat possessed. "That's interesting," Victor said, his eyes fixed on Rex with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. There was recognition there, and something else, a mixture of longing and bitter satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "That's quite a magnificent animal you have there. It would be a shame if something happened to him when you're forced to close down." The threat hung in the air like smoke, subtle but unmistakable. Frank stepped forward, and despite his age and failing health, he still cut an imposing figure. "I think you'd better leave now, Mr. Ashford." Victor adjusted his expensive watch with deliberate slowness. "Think about my offer, Mr. Henderson. You have 30 days before the bank forecloses. After that, well, let's just say the next buyer might not be as understanding about your animal collection." As the Mercedes disappeared down the dusty road, Grace found herself staring at the stack of overdue bills Frank had hidden in his desk drawer. The numbers swam before her eyes. $180,000 in debt, with creditors calling daily and the bank threatening foreclosure. She'd known the sanctuary struggled financially, but she hadn't realized how close they were to losing everything. Frank sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. I've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, Gracie. Thought I could make it work, thought something would come through. His voice broke slightly. I can't bear the thought of these animals ending up in cages again, or worse. Rex had positioned himself at the corner of his enclosure closest to Frank's office, his massive body pressed against the fence as if he could somehow protect his human through sheer proximity. The lion's behavior had become increasingly protective over the past week, and Grace realized with a chill that Rex somehow sensed what the humans were only beginning to understand, that their world was about to fall apart. The heart attack came without warning on a Thursday afternoon when the Texas sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Frank had been filling Rex's water trough, a task he'd performed thousands of times before, when the crushing pain exploded across his chest like lightning. The bucket slipped from his hands as he stumbled backward, his face draining of color as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. Rex knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. The massive lion launched himself against the fence with a roar that shattered the peaceful afternoon silence, his powerful voice carrying across the sanctuary like an alarm bell. The sound brought Grace running from the veterinary clinic, her heart hammering as she recognized the pure distress in Rex's call. She found Frank collapsed against the water trough, his breathing shallow and labored, his lips tinged blue. "Pops!" she screamed, dropping to her knees beside him as she fumbled for her phone. Rex continued his desperate roaring, pacing frantically along the fence line as other animals throughout the sanctuary began responding to his distress calls with their own cries of alarm. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours as Grace performed CPR while Rex maintained his vigil just feet away. The lion's golden eyes never left Frank's face, and even as the emergency team worked to stabilize the old man's failing heart, Rex remained pressed against the fence, his massive frame trembling with an emotion that looked heartbreakingly like human fear. "He's stable, but it was a massive heart attack," the lead paramedic told Grace as they loaded Frank into the ambulance. "At his age, with the damage we're seeing on the EKG, you need to prepare yourself for all possibilities." As the ambulance pulled away, its red lights flashing against the gathering dusk, Rex released a sound unlike anything Grace had ever heard from him, a low, mournful cry that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The lion then walked to the exact spot where Frank had collapsed and lay down, his head resting on his massive paws, as he began a vigil that would last for days. At Texas Hill Country Medical Center, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, his weathered hands clutching at the hospital sheets as he called out for Rex. "Where's my boy?" he asked again and again, his voice weak but urgent. "Who's going to take care of him if something happens to me?" Grace spent every moment at his bedside, leaving only when the nurses insisted she needed rest. During those brief absences, she would call Dorothy Mae Thompson, the elderly volunteer who had become like a grandmother to everyone at the sanctuary. Dorothy would report that Rex hadn't moved from his spot by the fence, hadn't eaten, and barely acknowledged anyone's presence. "That lion knows," Dorothy said, her voice heavy with worry. "Animals know things we don't, honey. They can sense when death is near." It was during Frank's second night in intensive care that Victor Ashford made his move. Grace was dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair when her phone buzzed with a text message. "We need to talk. Meet me in the cafeteria." She found him at a corner table, his expensive suit incongruous among the tired hospital staff and worried families. "Miss Williams," he said, standing with practiced courtesy, "I'm sorry to hear about Mr. Henderson's condition." "What do you want, Mr. Ashford?" Grace's exhaustion made her blunt, her usual professional demeanor stripped away by grief and fear. "I want to help," Victor said, sliding a folder across the table. "I'll pay all of Mr. Henderson's medical bills, every penny. I'll also buy the sanctuary for $3 million, well above market value. All I ask is that the animals be relocated within 30 days. Grace stared at the contract, the numbers blurring through her tears. $3 million would save Frank's life and ensure the animals found good homes, but it would also mean the end of everything he'd worked for. The animals, where would they go? I have connections with accredited facilities across the country, Victor assured her. They'll be well cared for. Some might even go to better situations than what you can provide. His voice softened slightly. Miss Williams, your surrogate father is dying. Don't let pride be the reason you lose him. Grace felt the weight of the impossible choice crushing down on her. Through the cafeteria windows she could see the lights of the sanctuary in the distance where Rex was maintaining his lonely vigil. The lion had refused all food for 48 hours, and Grace knew that without Frank, Rex might simply choose to waste away from grief. Back at the sanctuary, Rex's behavior was becoming increasingly disturbing to the volunteers who tried to care for the other animals. The massive lion had begun arranging objects in his enclosure, rocks, sticks, even his untouched food bowls, in deliberate patterns that seemed to point toward the hospital. When Dorothy attempted to approach his fence, Rex would look directly at her and release that same mournful cry that had accompanied Frank's collapse. It's like he's trying to tell us something, Dorothy confided to Grace during one of their phone calls. Like he knows exactly what's happening, and he's trying to send Frank a message. The local news had picked up the story of the lion mourning his keeper, and reporters were beginning to gather at the sanctuary gates. Social media posts about Rex's vigil were spreading across Facebook and Twitter, with people from around the world commenting on the extraordinary bond between man and beast. But for Grace, sitting alone in that sterile hospital room while Frank fought for his life, the attention felt meaningless. She had less than 24 hours to make a decision that would determine not just Frank's survival, but the fate of every animal he'd spent his life protecting. In the distance, she knew Rex was still waiting, still hoping for the return of the only human who had ever truly understood him. Frank's condition stabilized on the 4th day, but the doctors' faces remained grim as they delivered updates that felt more like eulogies than medical reports. Mr. Henderson has suffered extensive damage to his heart muscle, Dr. Patricia Martinez explained to Grace in the hallway outside intensive care. At his age, with his medical history, we're looking at a very difficult recovery. He'll need round-the-clock care, expensive medications, and there's no guarantee. The unfinished sentence hung between them like a death sentence. Grace nodded numbly, her mind calculating costs they couldn't afford, while her heart broke for the man who had given her everything. Through the small window in Frank's door, she could see him sleeping fitfully, his weathered face pale against the white hospital pillows. Meanwhile, Rex's vigil had entered its 5th day, and his condition was becoming critical. Dorothy called with increasingly desperate reports. The lion had lost nearly 30 pounds, his magnificent frame growing gaunt as he refused all attempts at feeding. Veterinarian colleagues from across Texas began arriving at the sanctuary, drawn by news reports and their professional concern for the grieving animal. "I've never seen anything like this," admitted Dr. Sarah Chen, an animal behaviorist from the University of Texas, who had driven 3 hours to observe Rex. "This level of sustained grief response is unprecedented in captive lions. He's demonstrating emotional intelligence that challenges everything we thought we knew about animal consciousness." Rex had begun creating elaborate patterns with objects in his enclosure, arranging rocks in perfect lines that pointed toward the hospital, organizing his untouched food into geometric shapes that seemed to carry meaning only he understood. When Dorothy played recordings of Frank's voice from old training videos, Rex would approach the speaker and press his massive head against it, releasing those heartbreaking cries that had become his constant communication with a world that couldn't understand his pain. The media attention intensified as the story spread beyond local news. National television crews set up outside the sanctuary gates, and the hashtag #SaveRex and Frank began trending on social media platforms. People from around the world shared the story, many adding their own tales of the extraordinary bonds they'd witnessed between humans and animals. But the growing fame felt hollow to Grace as she sat beside Frank's hospital bed, watching him struggle through another restless night. During his brief moments of consciousness, Frank's first words were always about Rex. "How's my boy doing?" he would ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he eating? Is someone singing to him?" Grace couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth, that Rex was slowly dying of heartbreak, that the magnificent lion who had been Frank's constant companion for over a decade was wasting away in grief. Instead, she held Frank's hand and lied with tears in her eyes. "He's fine, Pops. He's waiting for you to come home." Victor Ashford's visits became a daily torment. He would appear in the hospital cafeteria or waiting room, always impeccably dressed, always carrying new contract proposals with increasingly generous terms. "$4 million now," he would say, sliding papers across whatever surface separated them. "All medical expenses covered, plus a generous relocation fund for every animal. Miss Williams, you're watching two souls die when you have the power to save at least one of them." The worst part was that Victor wasn't entirely wrong. Grace had done the math a dozen times. Frank's medical bills were already approaching 6 figures, and his ongoing care would require resources the sanctuary simply didn't have. Even if he survived, the stress of financial ruin might kill him just as surely as his failing heart. It was Dorothy who provided the unexpected breakthrough on day 6. The elderly volunteer, who had been splitting her time between caring for the animals and supporting Grace, arrived at the hospital with a manila envelope and determination written across her weathered face. "Honey, I've been going through Frank's papers like you asked," Dorothy said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair. "I found some things you need to see." The envelope contained documents Grace had never seen before. Insurance policies, veteran benefit forms, and financial records that painted a very different picture of their situation. "Frank has a life insurance policy worth $500,000, Dorothy explained. "Military burial benefits, survivor benefits for you as his designated heir. And look at this, he's been putting money away in a separate account for years." Grace stared at the bank statements with growing amazement. Frank had been secretly saving money from his military pension, setting aside small amounts that had grown into a substantial emergency fund. "He knew," Grace whispered. "He knew his heart was failing, and he was preparing for this." "There's more," Dorothy said, producing a sealed envelope marked "For Gracie, Emergency Only," in Frank's careful handwriting. Inside, Grace found a letter that made her cry and laugh simultaneously. "If you're reading this, something's happened to me and you're probably scared and thinking you can't keep the sanctuary going," Frank had written. "Well, stop that nonsense right now. I've been planning for this day since my first heart attack 3 years ago. The money's there, the insurance will cover everything, and most importantly, you've got something no amount of money can buy. You've got love. Keep loving those animals, Gracie. Keep loving Rex. He's going to need you more than ever." But the most shocking discovery came at the bottom of Frank's hidden documents. Adoption papers, dated 5 years earlier, legally making Grace his daughter and heir to everything he owned. "He never told me," Grace whispered, tears flowing freely. "All this time, he never said a word." Dorothy smiled through her own tears. "That man loved you like his own flesh and blood. He just wasn't much for making speeches about it." The revelation changed everything. Grace now had the legal authority to make medical decisions for Frank. the financial resources to keep the sanctuary running, and most importantly, the security of knowing that Frank had planned for her future with the same careful attention he'd given to every animal in his care. But even as hope began to bloom in Grace's heart, Rex's condition continued to deteriorate. Dr. Chen called with increasingly urgent reports. The lion was now refusing water, his body beginning to shut down from dehydration and starvation. "We have maybe 48 hours before we reach the point of no return," she warned. "If Frank doesn't recover soon enough to see him, we might lose them both." The irony was devastating. Just as Grace discovered they had the resources to save the sanctuary, Rex was dying from the very grief that had prompted Frank's secret preparations. The lion's love for his human companion was so profound that he was choosing to follow Frank into death rather than live without him. It was then that Grace remembered the small video camera Frank had used to document the animal's progress over the years. Desperate to try anything that might reach Rex, she asked Dorothy to search Frank's trailer for recordings of his voice. What Dorothy found exceeded Grace's wildest hopes. Hours of footage showing Frank's daily interactions with Rex, their morning routines, their evening conversations, even recordings of Frank singing the old songs that had always calmed the great lion. "We have to try," Grace told Dr. Chen over the phone. "If Rex is truly mourning Frank like a human would, maybe hearing his voice will give him a reason to hold on." But as Grace prepared to rush back to the sanctuary with Frank's recordings, the hospital's emergency alarm began blaring. Through Frank's room window, she could see medical staff running toward the intensive care unit, their faces grim with purpose. Frank's heart monitor showed the erratic spikes and valleys that meant his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Standing in that sterile hospital corridor with Frank fighting for his life behind one door and Rex dying of heartbreak 50 miles away, Grace faced the terrible possibility that love, the very force that had brought them all together, might not be enough to save either of them. The recordings in her bag felt suddenly heavy with the weight of last hopes and desperate measures, while time continued its relentless countdown toward a conclusion that seemed increasingly inevitable. The medical team worked frantically around Frank's bed as his heart monitor displayed the chaotic rhythm of a man whose body was finally surrendering to the damage it had endured. Grace pressed herself against the hallway wall, watching through the small window as doctors and nurses moved with practiced urgency, their faces reflecting the gravity of what she already knew in her heart. This might be Frank's final battle. "We're losing him," she heard Dr. Martinez say to her colleague, the words cutting through Grace like a blade. "His heart can't take much more of this strain." At that exact moment, 50 miles away at the sanctuary, Rex released a roar that shattered the evening silence and sent every animal within a quarter-mile radius into frenzied response calls. Dorothy, who had been sitting vigil beside the lion's enclosure, later described it as the most heartbreaking sound she'd ever heard. Not the territorial roar of a predator, but the anguished cry of a soul in agony. "It was like he knew," Dorothy would tell reporters days later. "At the exact moment Frank took that turn, Rex knew. That big cat threw himself against the fence with such force that I thought he might actually break through." Back at the hospital, the medical team managed to stabilize Frank's heart rhythm, but Dr. Martinez pulled Grace aside with news that felt like a death sentence delivered in medical terminology. "We've bought some time, but his heart muscle is severely compromised. The next 24 hours are critical, and even if he survives, the damage is extensive. He'll need constant care, specialized medications, and there's a significant chance of future cardiac events." Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak as she processed what this meant. Even with Frank's hidden savings and insurance policies, the level of care he would need could bankrupt them within months. The sanctuary, Rex, and all the animals Frank had spent his life protecting would still be lost, just more slowly and painfully than before. Victor Ashford materialized in the waiting room like a specter, having somehow learned of Frank's crisis within hours. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carrying what might have been genuine sympathy, "I know this is a difficult time, but my offer still stands. $6 million now, all medical expenses covered indefinitely. You can save Frank's life and ensure every animal finds a perfect home." "Get out," Grace whispered, her grief transforming into rage. "How dare you come here now when he's fighting for his life?" "Because this might be your last chance to save him," Victor replied, unmoved by her anger. "Pride won't pay for the level of care he needs. Love won't cover the cost of keeping him alive." "But I can." What Victor didn't tell Grace, what he couldn't bring himself to admit even to himself, was that his obsession with acquiring Rex went far deeper than real estate development or business opportunities. In the privacy of his hotel room, Victor kept a small photograph of himself as a 7-year-old boy, standing beside a young lion cub at his father's circus. The cub in that faded image bore the same distinctive markings as Rex, the same golden eyes that had haunted Victor's memories for over a decade. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Rex was the last connection to Victor's father, to a time when the Ashford family circus had been a source of joy rather than bankruptcy and shame. When animal rights activists had shut down the circus, claiming the animals were being mistreated, Victor's father had spiraled into depression and alcoholism. The man who had once delighted children with his magnificent cats died alone and broken, convinced he had failed every creature in his care. Victor had spent 20 years building his real estate empire, telling himself he was moving beyond the past. But seeing Rex again had awakened a desperate need to reclaim something of his lost father. In his twisted logic, acquiring the lion wasn't about ownership. It was about redemption, about proving that the Ashford name could still provide for the animals his father had loved. But none of this emotional complexity was apparent to Grace, as she struggled with the impossible decision before her. Frank's condition continued to deteriorate despite the medical team's best efforts, and Rex's situation had become equally critical. Dr. Chen called with updates that grew more alarming by the hour. The lion was now showing signs of severe dehydration, his body temperature dropping as his systems began shutting down. "We've tried everything, Doctor," Chen reported during one of her frequent calls. "IV fluids, nutritional supplements, even mild sedatives to calm his distress. Nothing works. It's like he's made a conscious decision to stop living." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Henderson, Frank's son who had died in Afghanistan 15 years earlier. Grace discovered a box of letters in Frank's trailer, correspondence between father and son that revealed the depth of Frank's grief after Tommy's death. In one particularly heartbreaking letter, Tommy had written about the healing power of caring for others, about how helping wounded soldiers had given him purpose even in the darkest moments of war. "Dad, I know you're hurting," Tommy had written in what turned out to be his final letter. "But remember what you taught me. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to show itself. If something happens to me, don't let grief stop you from loving. Find someone or something that needs what you have to give." Reading those words, Grace realized that Rex wasn't just mourning Frank, he was reliving the same devastating grief that had nearly destroyed Frank after Tommy's death. The lion's refusal to eat, his vigil by the fence, his desperate arrangements of objects pointing toward the hospital, all mirrored Frank's own behavior in the months following his son's funeral. But there was something else in Tommy's letters, a detail that gave Grace the first real hope she'd felt in days. Tommy had written about training military dogs, about how animals could be taught to understand concepts like duty, loyalty, and the continuation of mission even after their handler's death. "The best military dogs," Tommy had explained, "don't shut down when their soldier dies. They transfer their loyalty to whoever continues the mission. Grace realized with stunning clarity what needed to happen. Rex needed to understand that Frank's mission, caring for the sanctuary's animals, protecting the helpless, showing love to creatures others had abandoned, could continue even if Frank couldn't. The lion needed a new mission, a way to honor his bond with Frank while finding a reason to live. Racing back to the sanctuary with a laptop full of Frank's training videos, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Not the desperate hope of denial, but the solid hope of purpose. She was about to attempt something that had never been tried before, communicating with a grieving lion using the recorded voice of the man he loved, convincing him that love could survive death by transforming into something new. As she drove through the Texas night, Grace could see Rex in her mind's eye, still maintaining his vigil by the fence, still waiting for a reunion that could never come. But maybe, just maybe, she could offer him something even more precious than Frank's return. She could offer him Frank's legacy and a new reason to keep his great heart beating. Grace arrived at the sanctuary to find Rex collapsed in his enclosure, his massive frame barely rising and falling with each labored breath. The magnificent lion who had once commanded respect through sheer presence now looked fragile, his golden coat dull and his eyes holding the vacant stare of an animal who had given up on life. Dorothy sat beside the fence with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her hands pressed against the chain link as if she could somehow transfer her own life force to the dying cat. "He's been like this for 3 hours," Dorothy whispered. "Dr. Chen says his organs are starting to shut down. Honey, I don't think he's got much time left." Grace knelt beside the fence and opened her laptop, her hands trembling as she navigated to the folder of Frank's recordings. The first video showed Frank during happier times, sitting outside Rex's enclosure with his morning coffee, talking to the lion about everything and nothing in the rambling way that had become their daily ritual. "Rex, boy, you listening to me?" Frank's voice emerged from the laptop speakers with startling clarity. The effect on Rex was immediate and devastating. The lion's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly alert as he struggled to his feet. He stumbled toward the sound, pressing his massive skull against the fence as a low whimper escaped his throat. "That's it, boy," Frank's recorded voice continued. "You know old Pops is always gonna be here for you." Rex responded by placing one enormous paw on the laptop screen, his claws extended as if he could somehow reach through the digital barrier to touch his beloved human. Grace scrolled through the recordings until she found what she was looking for. A video Frank had made just 2 months earlier, during one of his increasingly frequent hospital visits. His face was gaunt and tired, but his voice carried the same gentle authority that had calmed countless frightened animals over the years. "Rex, if you're watching this, it means I'm not coming back," Frank said from the screen. "And I need you to listen to me real careful, boy, because this is important." Rex's reaction was immediate. He sat on his haunches like an obedient dog, his full attention focused on the familiar voice. "You can't follow me where I'm going, son. That's not how this works. But you've got a job to do here, and I'm counting on you to do it." Frank's image on the screen looked directly into the camera as if he could see Rex watching. "Gracie needs you now. She's family, just like you and me, and family takes care of family." The change in Rex was subtle but unmistakable. His breathing became more regular, and he began to respond to Frank's voice with the same low rumbles that had characterized their morning conversations for years. When Frank's recorded voice said, "I love you, boy, and I always will," Rex pressed his nose against the laptop screen and released a sound that was part whimper, part purr, the same response he'd given to Frank's bedtime songs for over a decade. But the most remarkable moment came when Frank's voice delivered what seemed like a direct command. "Now drink some water for me, son. Show Gracie you're ready to get back to work." Rex immediately turned toward his water bowl and began drinking for the first time in 7 days, his powerful tongue lapping at the liquid as if Frank himself had ordered it. Dr. Chen, who had been documenting Rex's decline with clinical detachment, found herself wiping away tears as she watched the interaction. "This is unprecedented," she whispered to Grace. "He's responding to complex verbal commands from a recording as if Frank were actually present. The level of cognitive processing this requires." Grace barely heard the scientific analysis. She was focused entirely on Rex, who had now moved to his food bowl and begun eating with the methodical determination of an animal who had remembered his purpose. Between bites, he would look back toward the laptop, as if checking with Frank for approval. "He understands," Dorothy said with wonder in her voice. "That beautiful boy actually understands what Frank is asking him to do." The transformation wasn't complete. Rex still moved with the careful gait of an animal recovering from severe physical trauma, but the vacant hopelessness in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like determination. When Grace approached the fence, Rex came to her immediately, pressing his massive head against her outstretched hand in a gesture of acceptance that felt like a sacred trust. "I'll take care of him, Pops," Grace whispered to the laptop screen, where Frank's final message was ending with his characteristic gentle smile. "I promise I'll take care of them all." But even as hope bloomed in Grace's heart at Rex's recovery, her phone buzzed with a message that made her blood run cold. The text from the hospital was brief and devastating. "Frank took another turn. You need to come now. It may be time to say goodbye." Rex seemed to sense the shift in her emotions immediately. The great lion approached the fence again and released one of his deep, rumbling calls, but this time it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like a promise, a pledge from one member of Frank's family to another that whatever came next, they would face it together. Grace arrived at the hospital to find Frank awake and lucid for the first time in days, his weathered hand reaching for hers with surprising strength. The monitors around his bed painted a grim picture of his condition, but his eyes held the same gentle clarity that had made him a legend among the animals he'd spent his life protecting. "Gracie, honey," he whispered, his voice rough but determined. "I need to tell you some things before it's too late." Dr. Martinez had warned Grace that this moment might come, a brief rally before the final decline, when dying patients often experience a surge of energy that allows them to handle unfinished business. Grace gripped Frank's hand tightly, trying to memorize the feel of his calloused palm against hers. "I know about the recordings you played for Rex," Frank said, surprising her with his awareness. "Dorothy called and told me he's eating again. That boy always was too smart for his own good." A weak smile crossed Frank's face. "But there's something else I need you to know, something I should have told you years ago." Frank's revelation came in halting whispers that transformed Grace's understanding of everything she thought she knew about their relationship. 5 years earlier, when Grace had been considering a job offer in California, Frank had quietly begun adoption proceedings to make her his legal daughter and heir. He'd worked with lawyers and social workers for months, completing paperwork and undergoing evaluations, all while pretending their relationship was simply professional. "I was afraid you'd leave," Frank admitted, tears gathering in his eyes. "You had every right to build your own life somewhere else, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing the only daughter I'd ever have. When you decided to stay without knowing about the adoption, I figured maybe it was better to let sleeping dogs lie." The legal documents were all in Frank's safe at the sanctuary, along with life insurance policies worth nearly $1 million, veteran survivor benefits, and detailed instructions for the sanctuary's future operation. "I've been preparing for this day since my first heart attack 3 years ago," Frank continued. "The money's there to keep the sanctuary running for decades. You'll never have to choose between saving an animal and paying the bills." But Frank's most shocking revelation concerned Victor Ashford and the true reason behind his obsession with Rex. Through his network of contacts in the animal rescue community, Frank had learned that Victor's father, Marcus Ashford, had owned a traveling circus that had been shut down by animal welfare authorities in the early 2000s. Rex had been born in that circus, one of several lion cubs bred for entertainment purposes. "The boy's not evil, Gracie," Frank said, his breathing becoming more labored. "He's just carrying his daddy's guilt and shame, thinking that getting Rex back will somehow make things right. But what he doesn't understand is that love isn't about ownership. It's about letting go when you need to." As if summoned by their conversation, Victor Ashford appeared in the hospital doorway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "I heard you were awake," he said to Frank, his voice carrying a vulnerability Grace had never heard before. "I need to tell you the truth about why I want the lion." Victor's confession poured out in a torrent of long-suppressed grief and guilt. His father's circus had been his childhood paradise, a world of wonder where magnificent animals performed alongside acrobats and clowns. Rex had been Victor's special favorite, a playful cub who would wrestle with the 7-year-old boy and sleep curled up against him during long travels between towns. "When the authorities shut us down, they said we were abusing the animals," Victor said, his voice breaking. "But my father loved those cats more than anything in the world. Losing them destroyed him. He drank himself to death within 2 years, convinced he'd failed every creature in his care." The truth was even more heartbreaking than Grace had imagined. Victor's real estate empire had been built with a single purpose: acquiring enough wealth and influence to someday reclaim the animals his father had lost. In his twisted logic, bringing Rex back to circus life would vindicate his father's memory and prove that the Ashford family had been caretakers, not abusers. "I thought if I could give Rex the life my father intended for him, performing, being admired, living like the king he was born to be, then maybe my father's spirit could finally rest," Victor concluded, tears streaming down his face. Frank listened to Victor's confession with the same patience he'd shown countless frightened animals over the years. When Victor finished speaking, Frank gestured for him to come closer to the bed. "Son," he said, his voice barely audible, "your daddy would be proud of the man you became, not the animals you owned. Rex doesn't belong in a circus any more than you belong in the past." The moment that followed would haunt Victor for the rest of his life. Frank, using what must have been the last of his strength, reached out and placed his hand on Victor's shoulder. "If you really want to honor your father's memory, help us save all the animals, not just one. Help us build something your daddy would have loved, a place where every creature gets a second chance." Victor nodded through his tears, understanding for the first time that redemption couldn't be purchased or reclaimed. It had to be earned through service to something larger than his own pain. "I'll withdraw all my offers for the land," he whispered, "and I'll establish an endowment to keep the sanctuary running forever." Frank smiled, his mission finally complete. "Rex is waiting for me to come home," he said to Grace, "but he's not waiting for me to take him away from here. He's waiting for me to tell him it's okay to love someone new." His grip on Grace's hand tightened one final time. "Take care of my boy, Gracie, and let him take care of you." As Frank closed his eyes for the final time, the hospital room filled with a profound sense of peace. Outside, a Texas thunderstorm was beginning to build, and 50 miles away, Rex lifted his massive head toward the darkening sky, somehow sensing that the most important chapter of his life was about to end, and a new one was about to begin. The funeral took place 3 days later under the ancient oak tree where Frank had always said he wanted to rest. What began as plans for a small, private ceremony transformed into something extraordinary. as word spread through social media and news networks about the man who had devoted his life to giving abandoned animals a second chance. By the morning of the service, over 400 people had gathered on the sanctuary grounds, creating a sea of faces that stretched from the makeshift altar to the animal enclosures beyond. Grace had followed Frank's written instructions precisely, organizing a ceremony that honored both his military service and his dedication to animal welfare. The Marine Corps Honor Guard presented the flag with crisp precision while Rex watched from his enclosure 50 yards away, the lion's golden eyes tracking every movement as if he understood the significance of the ritual unfolding before him. Dorothy Mae Thompson, now serving as Grace's unofficial second-in-command, had spent the morning managing the crowd and ensuring that the animals remained calm despite the unprecedented gathering. "Frank would have gotten such a kick out of this," she whispered to Grace as they watched people of all ages filing past the simple wooden casket. "Look at all the lives he touched." The eulogies painted a picture of a man whose influence extended far beyond the sanctuary's boundaries. Sheriff Bob Martinez spoke about Frank's work with at-risk youth, teaching troubled teenagers responsibility through animal care. Dr. Patricia Martinez from the hospital described his patients with injured wildlife, how he would sit with wounded hawks and foxes for hours, talking to them in the same gentle voice he used with Rex. Local ranchers testified to his expertise in treating sick cattle, never accepting payment, but always available when animals suffered. But it was Grace's tribute that truly captured Frank's essence. Standing before the crowd with Rex clearly visible behind her, she spoke about the man who had taught her that love could heal any wound, bridge any gap, and survive any loss. "Frank Henderson never had biological children," she said, her voice carrying across the silent gathering. "But he was a father to every animal that needed one, a friend to every person who felt lost, and a teacher to anyone willing to learn that love has no boundaries." As Grace spoke, something remarkable began to happen. Rex, who had been lying quietly in his enclosure, slowly rose to his feet and began walking toward the crowd. The massive lion moved with deliberate purpose, his powerful frame cutting through the afternoon shadows as he approached the fence closest to Frank's casket. The crowd fell into absolute silence as Rex reached the chain-link barrier and sat on his haunches, his massive head held high with regal dignity. For several minutes, the only sounds were the gentle Texas breeze rustling through the oak leaves and the distant calls of other sanctuary animals who seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment. Then Rex did something that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. The great lion rose to his feet, approached the fence directly facing Frank's casket, and slowly lowered his enormous head until his forehead touched the ground. The gesture was unmistakably one of respect, of farewell, of a final salute from one soul to another. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as phones and cameras captured the moment that would soon be seen around the world. Children pressed closer to their parents, many asking in whispered voices if the lion was praying. Even the most cynical observers found themselves moved to tears by the raw emotion displayed by an animal who clearly understood that his dearest friend was gone forever. Victor Ashford, standing at the back of the crowd with his head bowed in genuine grief, felt the final pieces of his father's guilt finally fall away. Watching Rex's tribute to Frank, he understood for the first time what his father had tried to create in his circus: not entertainment but connection, not ownership but partnership, not spectacle but love. After the military honors concluded and Frank's casket was lowered into the Texas earth, something unprecedented occurred. Rex began to vocalize, but not with the anguished roars that had marked the past week. Instead, he released a series of deep, rhythmic calls that seemed almost musical in their cadence. Other animals throughout the sanctuary responded in kind. Lions, tigers, bears, and rescued farm animals, all adding their voices to what could only be described as a chorus of farewell. Grace had heard Frank mention this phenomenon before, how animals in the wild sometimes created communal vocalizations during times of significant change or loss. But witnessing it firsthand, with hundreds of people standing in respectful silence while dozens of animals sang their goodbye to the man who had saved them, felt like a miracle. The most touching moment came as the crowd began to disperse. Rex approached the section of fence closest to Frank's grave and carefully deposited something at its base, a small piece of rope that Frank had used in their daily training sessions. The lion had somehow retrieved it from his enclosure and carried it in his mouth as his final gift to his departed friend. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been documenting Rex's behavior throughout the ordeal, could barely contain her amazement. What we've witnessed here today challenges every assumption about animal cognition and emotional capacity, she told the gathering news crews. Rex has demonstrated grief, understanding of death, ritualistic behavior, and what can only be called love in its purest form. As the sun began to set over the Texas hills, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, Grace found herself standing alone beside Frank's grave, with Rex lying peacefully on the other side of the fence. The lion had positioned himself so that he could see both the fresh mound of earth and Grace's face, as if he was now dividing his attention between honoring the past and protecting the future. "You did good today, boy," Grace whispered to Rex, her voice thick with emotion. "Frank would have been so proud of you." Rex responded with one of his characteristic low rumbles, but this time the sound carried none of the desperate grief that had marked his behavior over the past week. Instead, it seemed to convey acceptance, understanding, and perhaps most remarkably, hope. Victor approached Grace as she prepared to lock up the sanctuary for the night. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice humble in a way she'd never heard before, "I've spoken with my lawyers about establishing the endowment we discussed. $2 million to start, with annual contributions to ensure the sanctuary never faces financial hardship again." Grace nodded her acceptance, too emotionally drained to express the gratitude she felt. As Victor walked toward his car, he paused and looked back at Rex, who was still maintaining his vigil beside Frank's grave. "Thank you," Victor said, though it was unclear whether he was addressing Grace, Rex, or Frank's memory. "Thank you for showing me what love really looks like." As darkness fell over the sanctuary, Grace made one final check on the animals before heading to her small apartment on the property. Rex remained by the fence, but his posture had changed from desperate vigil to peaceful guardianship. He was no longer waiting for Frank to return. He was honoring Frank's memory while embracing his new role as protector of everything Frank had built. The last thing Grace saw before turning off the lights was Rex lifting his massive head toward the star-filled Texas sky, releasing one final soft call that seemed to carry both goodbye and hello, ending and beginning, death and life all wrapped into a single profound moment of understanding. Frank Henderson's story reminds us that the greatest love stories aren't always between people. Sometimes they're between souls who choose each other across every barrier life can build. At 72, Frank discovered what so many of us fear we've lost: that our capacity to love and be loved doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. Rex didn't see an old man with a failing heart. He saw his hero, his protector, his family. And when Frank's time came, that magnificent lion taught the world that grief is just love with nowhere to go, that loyalty transcends species, and that the bonds we forge through kindness echo long after we're gone. In our golden years, when society whispers we're less valuable, Frank proved that our greatest chapters can still be unwritten. His legacy lives on in every animal saved, every heart opened, and every act of unconditional love that defies logic but defines humanity. Rex's vigil at that grave wasn't just mourning, it was a testament that love, real love, is the only thing that truly survives us all. Have you ever experienced a bond with an animal that changed your perspective on love and loss? What legacy of love are you building in your own golden years that will outlast your time here? Share your stories of unexpected connections and the animals who've touched your heart. Your experiences matter and inspire others to open their hearts too.